Here's a universal truth nobody talks about. The most dangerous predators aren't the ones with sharp teeth and claws. They're the ones with laminated badges, clipboard checklists, and the intoxicating high that comes from enforcing rules nobody asked for. I'm talking, of course, about Homeowners Association board members. My name's Daniel Reeves, 42 years old, software engineer with enough success to be comfortable, but not enough to be flashy. The kind of guy who blends into the background of most rooms, which, until recently, was exactly how I liked it. That changed on a Tuesday, in April, when I pulled into the visitor parking space outside my own townhouse at 11:47 p.m. after a 16-hour coding marathon. My assigned spot was blocked by construction debris from the renovations next door, and my brain was too fried to care about anything except falling face first into my bed. The orange violation notice appeared on my windshield by 6:15 a.m., $150. Fine for unauthorized use of visitor parking by a resident. As if the universe needed to kick me while I was already sleep-deprived. I would have paid it. Honestly. Despite the absurdity, despite knowing I was right, I would have written the check just to avoid confrontation. Conflict avoidance had been my default setting my entire adult life, but that changed when I met Diane Keller, president of the Lakeview Gardens HOA. The violation stands, she declared, looking down at me through narrowly framed glasses despite being 5 inches shorter. Her office in the community clubhouse screamed, "I take myself very seriously." Certificates of HOA leadership training mounted in heavy frames, binders labeled with tabs so precise they must have been measured with a ruler. My assigned space was blocked, I explained, showing her the photos I'd taken. Where exactly was I supposed to park? That's not the association's concern. You could have found street parking. The nearest street parking is 6 blocks away. Then, that's where you should have parked. She folded her hands primly on the desk. Rules exist for a reason, Mr. Reeves. Visitor spaces are for visitors only. If we make an exception for you, we'd have to make exceptions for everyone. The classic bureaucrat's defense. I'd heard it before from DMV clerks, airline customer service, and every petty official who'd ever denied a reasonable request. No, you wouldn't, I replied. You could use your judgment to recognize extenuating circumstances. Something flashed in her eyes. Annoyance at being challenged. The board's judgment is that the violation stands. You have 10 days to pay before late fees begin accruing. I should have let it go, written the check, chalked it up as an expensive lesson in HOA tyranny. Instead, I asked a question that would change everything. Who actually owns the parking lot? Diane blinked, clearly not expecting this line of inquiry. The association, of course. Are you certain? Because I've been reviewing my closing documents, and there's something interesting about the common areas. This was a bluff. I hadn't reviewed anything, but her reaction told me I'd hit a nerve. The parking area is association property, administered, according to the covenants that you agreed to when purchasing your unit. Her tone was dismissive, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes. Now, if there's nothing else, I'd like to see documentation of that ownership, I pressed. Specifically the deed to the parking areas. That's not something I have at my fingertips. If you want to submit a formal records request, there's a form and a $75 processing fee. Of course there was. As I left her office, I noticed 2 other board members waiting in the reception area. Patricia Wilkins, the vice president, a sharp-featured woman who ran the neighborhood watch with militant enthusiasm, and Melissa Brooks, the treasurer, whose husband owned the construction company currently renovating the unit next to mine, the same company whose debris had blocked my parking space. They exchanged looks as I passed. Not just any looks. The kind that mean a conversation about you will start the moment you're out of earshot. I'd always tried to avoid HOA politics. Keep my head down, pay my dues, follow the rules. But something about that exchange, about the casual arrogance of people who wielded their tiny authority like a weapon, sparked an unfamiliar feeling in me. It wasn't anger exactly. It was curiosity. The same kind I felt when encountering an interesting coding problem, a puzzle that needed solving. Who really did own that parking lot? The county records office website was a labyrinth of poorly designed interfaces and confusing search parameters, a digital version of bureaucratic obstruction. After 3 hours, I gave up and decided to visit in person. The clerk looked surprised when I requested the property records for Lakeview Gardens. "That's a big file," she warned. "You sure you don't want to narrow it down?" "I need to see everything," I replied, "especially anything related to the common areas." She returned with a cart containing several boxes. "These are just the development documents. Property transfers are separate. What exactly are you looking for?" "Ownership of the parking areas." She raised an eyebrow. "HOA dispute?" "Something like that." Check box 3. Original development plans and property parceling. That's usually where the weird stuff hides. 4 hours and hundreds of documents later, I found it. Not weird. Fascinating. Lakeview Gardens had been built in phases spanning 15 years. The original developer had created the first 3 buildings and common areas as planned, then ran into financial trouble. The project was sold to a second developer, who completed the remaining buildings but under a slightly different legal structure. The result? A patchwork of ownership that didn't quite match what residents believed. While most common areas were, indeed, owned by the HOA, several parcels, including 2 of the 4 parking areas, had never been legally transferred. They remained under the ownership of Legacy Partners, the second developer's company. Even more interesting, Legacy Partners had dissolved 3 years ago following bankruptcy. Their assets had been auctioned to settle debts, which meant someone else now owned those parking lots. But who? The trail led me to a small law firm specializing in property acquisitions. After convincing the receptionist I was a potential client, interested in similar investments, I met with a junior associate named Tyler. "Those commercial REO packages get bundled and sold in bulk," he explained. "Mostly to investment firms that either sit on them hoping for appreciation or try to monetize them somehow. How would I find out who bought a specific property from such a package?" He looked intrigued. "You have a parcel in mind?" I showed him the records I'd collected. He whistled. "You're saying these parking lots at Lakeview Gardens aren't actually HOA property? That's potentially lucrative?" "Potentially. Think about it. If the HOA doesn't own them but has been acting like they do, issuing fines, restricting access, the actual owner could have some interesting legal options." "Like what?" Tyler leaned forward. "They could negotiate a formal easement agreement with the HOA, or charge for access, or even close them off entirely and redevelop, depending on zoning." "How would I find the current owner?" "That would require some digging. Property investments like these often hide behind layers of LLCs." He studied me for a moment. "Can I ask why you're interested?" I gave him my most innocent smile. "Academic curiosity." "Right," he said, clearly not buying it. "Well, for your academic curiosity, I'd start with Westfield Asset Management. They acquired most of Legacy's commercial portfolio in the bankruptcy. As I stood to leave, he handed me his card. "If you find something interesting, give me a call. Property disputes are kind of my specialty." I was halfway home when the pieces clicked together. This wasn't just about a parking fine anymore. This was about something much more fundamental, who actually controlled the spaces we all took for granted. And I had a plan forming. Westfield Asset Management operated from a sleek office tower downtown. Getting past reception proved challenging until I mentioned I was interested in acquiring a specific asset from their REO portfolio. The asset manager, who finally agreed to see me, Jessica Winters, had the sharp eyes of someone who evaluated properties. And people by their potential return on investment. "We manage several REO packages," she said after I explained my interest. Legacy Partners' assets were distributed across multiple holdings. "Without a specific parcel number, I can't tell you." I slid the documents across her desk. "Parcels? 47B and 47C at Lakeview Gardens." She glanced at the paperwork, then tapped briefly at her computer. Her expression remained neutral, but I caught a flicker of surprise. "Interesting. These parcels are part of holding package LP375, currently owned by Meridian Ventures. Is that another management company?" "A private equity firm." She studied me more carefully. "May I ask why you're interested in these specific parcels?" "They're just parking lots. Parking lots that an HOA has been treating as their property for years, despite not actually owning them." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Ah, you're a resident, one who received a parking violation for using a space that the HOA apparently has no legal right to regulate." Jessica leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Reeves, I appreciate your detective work, but Meridian Ventures isn't likely to get involved in an HOA dispute over a parking ticket." "What if I wanted to buy those parcels?" she laughed. "They don't sell individual parcels from bulk acquisitions. The administrative costs alone—" "What if I wanted to buy the entire package?" Her laughter stopped. "LP375 contains 38 distressed properties across 3 counties. The asking price is north of $4 million. And if someone had that kind of money?" Jessica's expression changed from amused to calculating. "Then I'd suggest they contact Meridian directly. But fair warning, they're not known for their community-mindedness." As I left her office, my phone buzzed with a calendar notification. HOA fine due. The $150 that had started this whole investigation. $4 million versus $150. Rationally, there was no comparison. But this had stopped being about rationality the moment Diane Keller had refused to consider the circumstances. This was now about principle, and perhaps a bit about the intoxicating possibility of turning the tables. I had money saved. Not $4 million, but enough for a substantial down payment. My software company had recently been valued at $12 million during acquisition talks that ultimately fell through. I'd been disappointed then, but maybe those failed negotiations had been leading to this moment. That night I made a call to my financial advisor, then another to Tyler, the property attorney, and finally, one to a former colleague who now worked at Meridian Ventures. Sometimes the most satisfying code is the one that fixes a system's fundamental flaw, not just patches a surface bug. The negotiations took 3 weeks. Meridian wasn't interested in selling individual parcels, but they were willing to consider spinning off a smaller package of similar property types. Eventually, we settled on a deal: 8 parking lots and 3 small commercial strips from their REO holdings, including both Lakeview Gardens parcels, for $1.2 million. I leveraged my company stock, took out a substantial loan, and by mid-May, I was the proud owner of approximately 2 acres of asphalt spread across the metro area. During this time, the HOA had escalated my unpaid violation to a lien threat, adding $300 in administrative fees and late charges. The total now stood at $450, which I still hadn't paid. Instead, I scheduled another meeting with Diane Keller. "I'm afraid your time has passed for appeals," she said as I sat across from her desk. "The matter has been referred to our collections process." "I'm not here to appeal," I replied, setting a folder on her desk. "I'm here to discuss the ownership of parking areas B and C." Her expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened slightly on her pen. "I've already explained that all common areas are association property." That's actually incorrect. These documents show the complete chain of title for those parking areas. They were never transferred to the HOA. They belonged to Legacy Partners, then Westfield Asset Management, then Meridian Ventures. I slid another document across the desk. And as of last week, they belonged to me. The color drained from Diane's face as she scanned the deed. This must be a mistake. Those parking areas are designated common elements in our master plan. Designated, yes. Legally transferred, no. The original developer intended to transfer them but never executed the proper documents before selling to Legacy. This is absurd. You can't just own property that I legally purchased. I believe I can. I kept my voice calm, reasonable. Now, about that parking violation. She straightened, professionalism masking panic. This changes nothing about your violation. You parked in a visitor space as a resident, against regulations. Regulations that you had no legal authority to create or enforce, given that the HOA doesn't own the property in question. Our covenants clearly state, covenants can't grant control over property you don't own. That would be like me creating rules for your private garage. Diane's jaw clenched. What exactly do you want, Mr. Reeves? This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The culmination of weeks of research, negotiations, and financial commitments far beyond reasonable for a parking dispute. I want a revised parking policy that allows for exigent circumstances, administered with common sense rather than rigid enforcement. I want the violation against me withdrawn, along with all fines and fees. And I want a written acknowledgement that the HOA has been improperly claiming ownership of private property. Or what? I smiled. Or I'll exercise my rights as the property owner, including restricting access to those parking areas, charging for their use, or redeveloping them entirely. You're bluffing. You wouldn't eliminate parking for an entire community over $150. Fine. Would I spend over $1 million to make a point about fair governance? I already have. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I'd heard in years. The emergency HOA board meeting that evening was standing room only. Word had spread rapidly that someone had bought the parking lots, though details were hazy and rumors wild. Diane called the meeting to order with visible reluctance. Patricia Wilkins and Melissa Brooks flanked her, both looking like they'd bitten into something sour. We've called this meeting to address concerns about common area ownership, Diane began. There appears to be a discrepancy in the property records regarding 2 of our parking areas. Not a discrepancy, I said from my seat in the back. A fact. The HOA never owned those parking lots. All heads turned toward me. Diane's expression tightened. Mr. Reeves claims to have purchased these parcels and is threatening to restrict access unless certain demands are met. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. That's not entirely accurate, I replied, standing. I'm not making threats. I'm proposing a solution to a problem the board created through years of claiming authority they never legally possessed. I approached the front, handing out copies of the ownership documents to nearby residents. The HOA has been issuing fines, dictating usage rules, and treating these parking areas as their property. But they never were. And when I discovered this fact, after receiving an unjustified parking violation, the board doubled down rather than acknowledging their error. Patricia Wilkins stood up, her voice sharp. This is nothing but a vindictive response to proper rule enforcement. Mr. Reeves thinks he's above the regulations we all agreed to follow. Regulations about property the HOA didn't own, I countered. Would you like to explain to everyone how the board justified collecting fines for violations on private property? Melissa Brooks jumped in. The covenants clearly cannot extend the HOA's authority beyond its legal boundaries, I finished for her. Just like they can't authorize you to charge for parking on the public street or dictate the color of someone's house in another neighborhood. The crowd was growing restless. A resident near the front raised his hand. So what happens now? Do we lose our parking? That depends on the board, I replied. I've proposed a reasonable solution. Revise the overly rigid parking policies, withdraw the unjustified fines, and acknowledge the ownership situation. In exchange, I'll grant an easement allowing continued use of the parking areas under fair terms. And if we refuse? Diane asked. I shrugged. Then I'll exercise my rights as the property owner, which could include restricting access, charging market rates for parking, or exploring other uses for the land. You'd really take away parking from your own neighbors over a power struggle with the board? Patricia demanded. Would you really risk losing community parking over refusing to administer rules with basic human consideration? I countered. Another resident stood up, Maria Chen, who lived across from me and had received similar violations in the past. I think we should hear exactly what changes Mr. Reeves is proposing before we dismiss them, she said. Some of the parking regulations have been unnecessarily strict. More nods throughout the room. The tide was turning. I outlined my proposals: extenuating circumstances, exceptions, a warning system before fines, resident use of visitor spaces during off-peak hours when visitor spaces were empty, and board decisions subject to community review. These are all reasonable accommodations, I concluded, the kind that foster community rather than resentment. The meeting devolved into heated debate, with residents increasingly vocal about their own frustrations with HOA enforcement. It became clear that the parking dispute had merely lanced a boil of accumulated grievances against the board's management style. After nearly 2 hours, Diane called for order. "We'll need to consult our attorney before agreeing to anything," she announced. "This meeting is adjourned until further notice." But the residents weren't finished. Maria Chen stood again. "I move that we hold an immediate vote of no confidence in the current board," she declared. "Their mismanagement of association property and punitive enforcement practices have created this situation." The motion was seconded instantly by multiple voices. Diane banged her gavel repeatedly. "This is not a proper procedure. You can't just—" "Actually, they can," I interrupted, holding up a copy of the HOA bylaws. Article 7, Section 3 allows for emergency removal of board members by 2/3 vote at any properly noticed meeting if they've demonstrated gross negligence in their duties. I'd say claiming authority over property you don't own qualifies. What followed was the HOA equivalent of a palace coup. The vote passed overwhelmingly. Diane, Patricia, and Melissa were removed from the board, replaced by an interim committee that would oversee new elections. As the crowd dispersed, excited conversations filling the room, Diane approached me with cold fury in her eyes. "Congratulations," she hissed. "You've destroyed 3 years of dedicated volunteer work over a parking space." "No," I replied quietly. "You did that when you chose rigid enforcement over basic humanity. I just owned the property where it happened. The aftermath unfolded better than I could have imagined." The interim board readily agreed to my proposed changes, eager to secure the parking area's continued availability. Tyler, my attorney, drafted a 99-year easement agreement that protected both community access and my ownership rights. The fine system was completely overhauled. Warnings replaced immediate penalties for first offenses. Circumstances were considered rather than dismissed. And most importantly, a new appeals process was established with rotating community members, not just board officers, making final decisions. My original $150 violation was officially rescinded, along with dozens of others that had been issued, for similar technical infractions. The story might have ended there, a satisfying conclusion to an absurd escalation. But there was one final twist. 3 weeks after the board overhaul, I received a call from Jessica Winters at Westfield Asset Management. "That was quite a stunt you pulled at Lakeview Gardens," she said without preamble. "Not a stunt. A correction. Whatever you call it, it's created quite a stir in property management circles. Turns out there are hundreds of similar parcels across the country, common areas that were never properly transferred to HOAs but have been treated as association property for years. Sounds like a systemic problem." It is. And several investment groups are now looking into acquiring them specifically to leverage against HOAs. Her voice turned serious. They won't all be as reasonable as you were, Mr. Reeves. Some will see this as pure profit opportunity, public relations be damned. I hadn't considered the broader implications. My personal victory could become a template for something uglier. Predatory investors targeting communities without my restraint or connection to the residents affected. What are you suggesting? My firm is establishing a program to identify these properties and work with HOAs to properly transfer ownership before they become targets. We could use someone with your technical background and unique perspective. You want me to help prevent others from doing what I did? I want you to help create fair solutions before situations escalate to property acquisitions and community disruption. Your technical skills could help identify vulnerable associations, and your experience provides valuable insight. It was ironic considering how this all started, but also strangely fitting. I'm listening, I said. 6 months later, I found myself presenting at the National HOA Management Conference, a gathering I would previously have avoided like the plague. My topic: property rights and common areas, avoiding the ownership gap. In the audience sat representatives from over 200 homeowners associations, including a chastened Diane Keller, who had reinvented herself as a community relations consultant for struggling HOAs. Our eyes met briefly as I concluded my presentation. She gave me a tight nod. Not forgiveness, not friendship, but perhaps a grudging acknowledgement that sometimes systems need breaking before they can be fixed properly. I still owned the parking lots at Lakeview Gardens, though the improved easement agreement ensured community access under fair terms. The new board had proven remarkably effective, focusing on genuine community needs rather than petty enforcement. And I still parked in visitor spaces occasionally when circumstances warranted. A small but satisfying reminder that rules work, best when administered with judgment rather than rigid adherence to the letter of the law. Sometimes the highest form of ownership isn't controlling access to property, but ensuring its proper use. And sometimes the most effective response to unreasonable authority isn't just resistance, but reconstruction, all from a $150 parking ticket that no one with sense would have pursued this far. Was it worth it? The money spent, the time invested, the community temporarily disrupted? Ask me on any day when I pull into a visitor space at 11:47 p.m., exhausted after a long day, and walk to my door without fear of an orange violation notice appearing on my windshield. The answer is always yes.